Let's start looking at one of the opening labels for the Slavery and Freedom exhibition. Right behind me is the label that speaks to the making of the Atlantic world. It's really powerful because we actually feature the story of Queen Nzinga, who was one of the leaders along the Western African coast. She was in West Central Africa, and she was over the Mabundo people. She actually strategically aligned with the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the church, all in an effort to avoid her own people from being enslaved, as well as avoid being involved in the slave trade. But you'll notice that right below her story is a quote from a gentleman of European descent. The statement says, "While I admit I am sickened at the purchase of slaves, I must be mum, for how would we do without sugar or rum?" What's very important about that statement and this juxtaposition is to really think about the morality of this particular story. What moral obligations do we have to each other? Concentrate on that opening line. I admit that I am sickened at the purchase of slaves. But then again, I must be mum, for how would I do without sugar or rum? It's very important that we look at those moral issues as we go through this exhibition. And I have to point out as well that we do not start this exhibition with the story of slavery. We start this exhibition with the story of humanity. And we actually start in Africa, looking at it as a continent made up of many people, places, society, cultures, intellect. So let's go ahead and look at some of the other objects in the exhibition. As we discussed, we just came through the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, looking at the making of the Atlantic world, and really the making of a global economy. The driver of the trade at that time was sugar, and that driver of the trade actually moved forward the effort to ship as many human beings across the Atlantic Ocean forced into slavery. And so now we come to the story of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, of course, being that space transporting Africans from the west coast of Africa throughout the Americas, across the Atlantic Ocean. We're fortunate to feature some really dynamic objects in this space, including artifacts from a slave ship found off the coast of South Africa, the São José. The São José actually left Lisbon, went to Mozambique, Africa, picked up captive Africans on its way to Brazil to sell them as enslaved Africans. The ship crashed off the coast of South Africa. We're very fortunate to have organized with George Washington University, Ezekiel Museums, the University of Cape Town, and partners in Mozambique, as we were able to identify this slave shipwreck on the ocean floor off the coast of South Africa. One of the key markers to identify this as a shipwreck, a slave shipwreck in particular, is some of the archival research revealed that, in fact, there were 1,400 ballast stones on the ship. Those ballast stones were used to offset the human weight. And we know that, in fact, there were ballast stones on the ship because we found them on the ocean floor. So we're excited to be able to feature those in this particular space in the Middle Passage. One thing that visitors will note is that we do not have images in this space. In fact, we chose to allow the first-person voice to carry the space. We wanted those who went through this experience to speak for themselves. And while we talk about this human story, the human story extends to everybody. So you'll hear voices of those who were enslaved, but you'll also hear voices of crew members. You'll hear voices of slave ship surgeons, all discussing, in fact, the horrors of this experience, but also understand, again, there is an important understanding of the resistance, the resilience, and the survival. We think of human suffering, but you also have to think of the power of the human spirit. How could someone hold on to live through that experience?
The despondency which seizes their spirits when thus confined soon becomes fatal. Every morning, perhaps more instances than one are found of the living and the dead fastened together.
Across the way from the Middle Passage space is the transatlantic slave trade space. Again, we look at one of the themes, profit and power juxtaposed against the human cost. In that space, we have it designed where you see the business of the trade, the development of the plantation system, and we also see how everyone benefited from the trade. But we also look at the human cost through the voices of those who were enslaved and the process of enslavement. One of the objects I'd like to point out to you in that particular space is the Fox's Wage Book. The Wage Book features the wages that were given to crew members who served on a slave ship. Again, looking at the human story. So we look at the crew members on the slave ship, and that document actually tells us two things. One, it lets us understand that everyone benefited from the trade. But then you have to ask yourself, why would someone serve on a slave ship? We often think, well, perhaps they wanted to gain passage to the New World, or they needed to feed their family, or in fact, going back to that moral issue, perhaps they thought it was just fine to make money and profit off the sale of humans. But it's important to note, when you open up that book, you will find that many crew members actually committed suicide or ran away. Again, this goes to that human experience. The human experience extends to everybody. And looking at the people below in the hulls of the ship, we understand that slave ship crew members would pack the hulls of those ships tight pack or loose packing. And that experience, oftentimes, the slave ship captain said, how much cargo you can bring depends on how many small enslaved people you can fit into the hull of a ship. It's a very powerful story. So now we're going to go into the colonial North America space of the exhibition. Allow me to explain to you some of the design treatment that we've used to help unpack this story. In fact, we break out the section by region because this is not a monolithic story. Africans in America shaped the landscape and were shaped by the landscape. So the regions that we break out include the Chesapeake, where we actually look at the making of race. Then we move into low country down in the Carolinas and the Gullah Islands and in Georgia area. And that allows us to look at enslaving skill. Then we come to Louisiana and we consider the convergence of cultures. And finally we come to the north and we look at the urban environment and a merchant system. Now, what's important to note is in each of these spaces, the treatments are done pretty much in a pattern, but they each have their own unique features. But it's important for me to let you know about that pattern. From the beginning, you see some of the regions of Africa where many of the people came from and to in the specific region in the Americas, particularly in North America. But you'll also see how the laws change over time and start to define whiteness, and you start to see how Africans become black in America. You start to see the status development of all people in North America, from planter elite to yeoman white farmer to poor white, free black, and enslaved African. You'll look at work in the space, you'll look at life in the space, escape in the space, and then we really start to unpack the story of freedom through the story of rebellion. And of course, we humanize everything. So we feature individual stories, personal stories about people who actually lived, labored, and rebelled in these spaces during this time. All of this is foundational to the development of the nation. And so what comes next is the fight for liberty. But remember, I said slavery and freedom was from the beginning. So the fight for liberty is a national fight, but the fight for freedom is one that had been going on amongst Africans from the time they were carried from the interior all the way to this point. So why don't we go to the section on the paradox of liberty, where we really start to unpack the story of what liberty and freedom means and this pivotal moment in time as the nation is taking shape.
Including Lexington.
So we've come from colonial North America and we are passing through the story, a powerful story about the Revolutionary War. Well, now, as I mentioned, we're entering into the paradox of liberty. But first, let me show you a very powerful object that's personal and speaks to genealogy and the importance that the role of genealogy plays in helping to tell this story. Again, we enter into this revolutionary period and there's freedom everywhere, or so one would think. Freedom and liberty are the call of the day. Here we have a space that looks at free communities of color that were all over the nation at the time, believe it or not. But one of the poignant objects that we have also shows that, in fact, while there were free communities of color, there were limits to that freedom. We were fortunate to be contacted by a woman, Elaine Thompson, a wonderful woman in Virginia who took the time to really take care of her family heirloom piece. It is this handmade tin owned by her ancestor, Joseph Trammell. He actually made that handmade tin to protect, as I like to say, his freedom. In fact, it was used to protect the Freedom Papers from 1852. Those freedom papers were vastly important to him because at any moment's notice, someone could challenge his freedom and he would have to prove that. He had to register every 2 years in Virginia, and it gives us a little more insight on the personal experience of being free during this particular time. Sadly, Elaine Thompson has passed on, but she was the steward of her family's history, and she, through genealogy, was able to unpack quite a bit of her family's story. But we're very fortunate because at this point, her great niece has now picked up the mantle and she is carrying it forward. She wrote a book at age 9 with the assistance of her great aunt, and now she's getting ready to rewrite that book at age 16 and carry that genealogical research further. So we're looking forward to working with her more on unpacking the story of this family and the significance of Joseph Trammell during the period of slavery and freedom in his status as a free black man. Now, let's look over at the paradox of liberty. Again, remember, we talk about the story of free communities of color. Well, you imagine at the time you have free African Americans who align with enslaved African Americans, again, a collective voice fighting for freedom. But they're fighting for freedom in a nation founded on liberty, but still maintaining slavery. Directly behind me, you see the cast figures of Benjamin Banneker and Thomas Jefferson. This is a platform featured in the exhibition where we really unpack that story of voices of freedom. Included on that platform, in addition to Jefferson and Banneker, are Toussaint Louverture, Mom Bet, who actually petitioned for her freedom in Massachusetts and won, as well as Phyllis Wheatley, all voices of freedom. What's very powerful to me about the connections between Banneker and Jefferson includes Benjamin Banneker sending his almanac to Thomas Jefferson and stating, in fact, African Americans are brilliant, they are human, they contribute to the development of this nation and deserve to be free. And excuse me if I paraphrase, but Thomas Jefferson essentially said, you are the exception, and freedom was not going to come during his particular time in life. So now, why don't we go forward and look at making a way. Again, remember, this is a human story. So in the midst of all of this inhumanity, you still have African Americans, again, fighting for freedom, fighting for liberty, fighting for the nation, to recognize them as citizens in this world, right? But as we go forward, we look at, while there were laws restricting them, African Americans found ways to go around those laws and hold on to their humanity. So why don't we go to the section on making a way out of no way? Understand that many things happened after the Revolutionary War, including the development of the cotton gin in 1793, and the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and the end of the international slave trade in 1808. What did all of that mean? Well, please note the space that we're in right now. Directly in front of me is a tower of cotton, which is a marker as the driver of the trade, no different than sugar was during the early period. So as we come out of this paradox of liberty and we look at, directly to my right, all of these pieces of legislation, from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all through 1820 Compromise, 1830 Compromise, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott decision. And then you see, paired with those, actual excerpts from speeches, sermons, from newspaper articles, all written by African Americans speaking back to the moment. To my left is the story of the domestic slave trade. Again, remember, 1793, the cotton gin is produced. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase takes place. That means that there's more land to cultivate cotton, and cotton is high demand, and it's being produced more efficiently. But that demand has an impact on African American bodies, and mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, husbands, and wives are all being sold away from the upper South to the lower South to produce more cotton in the fields down south. At the same time, remember, this is a story of slavery and freedom. So those same men, women, and children are fighting for their freedom all along the way, defining freedom for this nation. One of the more pivotal stories and iconic stories is that of Nat Turner. We're fortunate to be able to feature a Bible that we understand was owned by Nat Turner at the time of his escape and at the time of the rebellion. Nat Turner is pivotal because, like many other rebellions that took place throughout the nation and actually throughout the African diaspora, it really made an impact on this country. Laws tightened up. And while those laws tightened up, still African Americans found ways to go around those laws. Allow me to point out that we have a section directly behind me entitled Making a Way Out of No Way, where we look at the black codes and the slave codes, codes that defined status and ability, autonomy. So African Americans, free or enslaved, oftentimes were restricted more than you can imagine. For example, illegal to marry, illegal to read, illegal to gather, illegal to practice their faith. One of the objects that I'd like to point out is, again, a family object. We were fortunate enough to be contacted by Miss Shirley Burke in Detroit, who reached out to us and donated her ancestors' violin that he was given by a slave owner to perform during gatherings at the plantation site. We were fortunate to restore the violin and have it on display here. That violin is important to the law regarding illegal to gather. Oftentimes, African Americans in the hush of night would find ways to gather and practice their faith, find ways to gather and actually leisure and love one another at the same time. So, allow us to go down the hall and go see the slave cabin next, which is a very poignant story, and it's a community story. Again, remember, this is a shared history. So we've come from the story of the driver of the trade being cotton, and we're in the antebellum period. And again, we see the nation and all the cacophony of activity going on, and the development of legislation all deeply embedded with slavery. We also look at the human story of African American men, women, and children finding ways to go around black codes and slave codes. But we also have a deeper understanding of that very personal experience of being sold away on the auction block, and also that juxtaposition of profit and power also associated with that experience on the auction block. It's important to note that one of the design features we have in this exhibition is that we have a wall filled with excerpts from bills of sales and broadsides. So you will see a young boy sold for $5. $5 for a young black boy is what the excerpt says. Understand that $5 is the monetary value, but the value of that young boy to his mother, to his brother or sister is immeasurable. That gets us to the story of life, work, and enslavement, and looking at the many complexities of this human experience during the antebellum period. We're fortunate enough that we were able to receive a call from the Edisto Island Historic Preservation Society that wanted to donate a slave cabin to our museum. They knew that we were looking for a slave cabin to really help tell this story in a powerful way. And fortunately, they had one from Point of Pines Plantation located on Edisto Island in South Carolina. What's really powerful about this cabin is on the front side, we actually interpret it looking at slavery. On the back side, we interpret it looking at freedom. Because in fact, on Edisto Island, that is where the Union Army camped out during the period of the Civil War. And you see where land is given to the African American community and taken away several times until it is ultimately taken away for good. But let's talk about the interpretation in terms of slavery. Notice the cabin behind me. What's important about that cabin is not unlike where people locked up animals at night that worked the fields, not unlike the enslaved men, women, and children. This really could be considered a pen. But African American men, women, and children, again, through resistance and resilience and holding on to their humanity, found ways to love one another, to practice their faith, to grow gardens on the side of their cabins to supplement their diets, and to create new cultural practices. While we look at life, work, and enslavement, in this same space, we break down members of the community, the nurturers, the builders, the cultivators. Allow me to speak about the builders as one example. The story of Solomon Williams, who was a blacksmith on a plantation in Cane River. We look at his story through life, work, and enslavement. He created an ornate drill bit that was used practically every day for work on the plantation site. This is a gentleman who had no education, but this drill bit is an architectural feat. And you look at his same skill set he used to create an ornate grave marker for his wife. He used those same skills to create grave markers for members of the enslaved community throughout his plantation site. But he also, no doubt, as a blacksmith, created the shackles that were used on the enslaved on the plantation site. Again, that gives us more depth. We don't look at a broad stroke, just like in colonial North America. We don't look at just what he wore, what he ate, when he got up in the morning, how much land he cultivated. In fact, this is a man, and his story is told through life in terms of how he designed those ornate grave markers, work in terms of his inability to be educated, but still being able to create that ornate double helix drill bit, and in terms of enslavement, being responsible for actually creating the restraints on the plantation site. So that takes us next to the story of the coming of the Civil War. So allow me to take you around and we'll talk about the coming of the Civil War and how actually complex that story is. It's not just North versus South, but there were many voices involved in this fight. So we've just come from the slave cabin, and one thing I want to point out with the slave cabin is we can talk about objects and their importance there in the historical context, but what's also important to note, again, is how we acquire these objects. And so in the process of actually dismantling the slave cabin, we actually had community members come out and help us unpack the story of the community. Included in that community are the descendants of the enslaved as well as descendants of the slaveholding family. We were very fortunate to meet with both groups together and talk about the importance of this history coming to the general public to get a deeper understanding of what it is to be American and all the complexities and nuances of this particular story of slavery and freedom in the U.S. Now, we know about slavery and we know about freedom, and we know that there was a civil war which had a major impact on this nation. We look at the story of the Civil War and keeping the Union together, and embedded in the secession papers is slavery. But understand that African Americans fled to the Union lines as they came closer to where many of these plantation sites were located. At that time, the Confederates demanded their property back, but the Union Army declared them contraband of war, and as such, they were able to keep them as contraband of war. These men, women, and children turned this fight for keeping the Union together into a fight for freedom. And as such, one of the greatest speakers of our time and one of the most influential members of the African American community and America itself is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass led the charge on pushing for freedom, and in constant dialogue with Abraham Lincoln ensured that African American men could in fact fight on the battlefield for their freedom. Right behind me is a dynamic broadside that we were fortunate to receive, where you see a call for men of color to arms. You can only imagine how powerful that must have been for African American men to understand that they could suit up and fight for their freedom and ensure the freedom of the generations to follow them. Again, Frederick Douglass played a pivotal role. While he ensured that African American men could fight in the Union Army, he also was influential in a constant dialogue with President Lincoln to ensure that freedom came through the Emancipation Proclamation and ultimately the 13th Amendment. We would be remiss if we told the story about the Civil War and left out the story of women's involvement in the Civil War. When you visit, you'll also see artifacts that speak to the efforts of Charlotte Fortin Grimke, who educated many of the people who were at these contraband camps. You'll also see the story of Harriet Tubman, which many of us know Harriet Tubman with the Underground Railroad, but she also served as a Union spy. And finally, you'll see the story of Susie King Taylor, who not only served as a nurse, but ultimately opened up her own hospital. So why don't we go forward and look at some of the artifacts that really speak to freedom during the period of emancipation. How do you tell a whole population of people that they are now free? In fact, those same men that Frederick Douglass fought for to ensure that they were able to fight for freedom on the battlefield were responsible for carrying things such as this very important, tiny but powerful handheld Emancipation Proclamation. They carried a handheld Emancipation Proclamation from plantation to plantation and told men, women, and children they were no longer enslaved.
My name is Bill Pretzer. I'm the Senior History Curator here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and we're entering the exhibition Defending Freedom, Defining Freedom, the Era of Segregation. At the end of the Civil War, African Americans who were released from their bondage immediately sought about creating their own lives with their own resources. And one of the first things many of them tried to do was to reconnect with family members who had been separated during the era of slavery. They traveled the country looking for their relatives. They placed ads in newspapers, primarily church-related newspapers, seeking to find their kinfolk. They wrote letters to the Freedmen's Bureau. They wanted to reconnect and build communities amongst themselves. And so one of the major elements of that process was creating all-black towns. Not welcome in the wider society, a number of African Americans reconnected with their families and created towns where they built not only their homes, like this building out of Poolesville, Maryland, what was then called Jonesville, Maryland, in northern Montgomery County, but also schools and churches in those communities. This particular building was built by John Hall in 1874. It compares, or contrasts rather, with the slave cabin you've seen earlier by being a two-story building. It was a measure of his and his family's ambitions and optimism for the future. They actually had just bought land, so they were freehold farmers, not tenant farmers or sharecroppers. And with others in their community, they built one of 9 actually, all-black towns in Montgomery County in the late 1870s and 1880s. It was a mark of their independence, and it mirrored towns across the country. This building was still in use as a family home, although highly renovated, well into the 20th century. And the family that still owned the home, once it was being abandoned, decided to donate it to this museum after researchers had found this in what is now Poolesville, Maryland. Our researchers went up, examined the building. We had to take off the siding and the interior whiteboard to see what the logs underneath looked like. We contracted with a buildings conservator, dismantled the building log by log, restored the parts of it that we could restore, replaced a few parts, and then rebuilt it here in the museum, again, log by log, for this display. There are actually hundreds of cabins that were inhabited by enslaved individuals that have been reused decade after decade. The slave cabin that we saw earlier in the tour in our Slavery and Freedom exhibition was occupied until the 1980s. Most of them have been reconstructed, updated, vinyl siding, but the current inhabitants don't even realize that underneath the shell of the building is the structure of a former slave cabin. We're going to see the rest of the response to this kind of independence with the creation of a segregated society, and then the response to that with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. At the very end of the Civil War, African Americans had civil rights in the former Confederacy, and in fact had voting rights and produced legislatures in which over 1,900 African Americans had served in state legislatures in southern states. In 1877, the political compromise removed Northern troops from the former Confederacy. That allowed white society to begin a campaign of removing the civil rights that African Americans had received at the very end of the Civil War and recreating slavery by another name, a segregated society, what we have come to call Jim Crow. The initial elements had changes in state laws which limited the rights of African Americans, limited their right to move, limited their right to vote, limited their rights to serve on juries, limited their economic rights. But it simply wasn't the imposition of new laws. It was the support of those laws by a reign of terror, quite frankly. And the symbol of that terror has come to be the Ku Klux Klan. But the Klan was not the only element of terror. It was a broadly societal effort that is epitomized by the Klan. Founded in 1865, the Klan was established to enforce new kinds of laws and the creation of a new type of white supremacy. African American society was attacked on all levels, not simply physical violence, but psychologically and intellectually, and by the denial of all of their rights. But African Americans responded to that in a way that created their own society and allowed them to express their own vision for the future. The white hood became the symbol of the Ku Klux Klan and was widely seen across society, protecting the identity of individuals, although in most communities everyone knew who was underneath the hood. But it wasn't just the physical terror epitomized by the Klan and by the lynchings that the Klan and other parts of society conducted. More than 4,000 individuals were illegally murdered with no consequences on the perpetrators from the 1880s into the 1940s. It was a constant process of terror, of intimidation. The other part, however, was not so physical. It had to do with intellectual and psychological intimidation. So the publication of a book, The Negro, a Beast, in 1900, in which it perpetrates the idea that African Americans were put on earth to serve white people. They are not their own beings. They are not their own human beings. They are not their own selves. They are here as servants for society. That kind of intellectual structure and the psychological makeup that had on white society, as well as the detrimental effects on African Americans, which had to resist that constant barrage of negative information about them, created a sense of terror that was constant and unremitting. And yet African Americans responded in a number of very creative ways. It wasn't simply physical terror, but it involved things like a constant denigration of African Americans, so that stereotypes, what have become collectibles in 20th and 21st century America, were actually constant reminders to white people that African Americans were inferior, and constant reminders to African Americans that white society did not value them as individuals and as productive members of society. The response of the African American community, however, was not simply defensive. It was an expressions of their own vision for the future. And so they built educational institutions. They built community and civic organizations. They focused on their churches. They created entrepreneurial enterprises. They valued the black press, a free press that communicated information. They built a society within the larger society that both responded and protected them from that larger society, but also expressed their own values and their own sense of what the future could be for themselves and for their children. A very typical American approach to life. In the early 20th century, there was beginnings of a massive migration of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities. This great migration, as it's called, changed the character and allowed more opportunity for African Americans to engage in modern society in those northern cities. It also changed the character of their sense of themselves and their opportunities. So in the 1920s, right after World War I, where African Americans had served in great numbers, particularly in France, in the military, there comes an efflorescence, an engagement with cultural expression that has become known as the New Negro or the Negro Renaissance. This is The Migration of the Negro by Jacob Lawrence, an artistic rendition, a retrospective looking back on the experience of movement of massive numbers, millions of African Americans to northern cities between 1910 and 1940. By the mid-20th century, Jim Crow society was well established north and south in the United States, and in the West for that matter. The tradition, however, of response to that Jim Crow society, of efforts to expand civil rights for African Americans, had continued since the late 19th century, well through the early parts of the 20th century. And by the 1950s and 60s, that is just after World War II, where African Americans again served in the military and came home to a segregated society that did not accept them entirely, the notion of a concerted biracial civil rights movement grew and took on more added energy and strength. On the other side of this whites-only door, we have instances of violence against African Americans who were active in the civil rights movement before there was a civil rights movement. In the 1940s and 50s, activists constantly tried to put pressure on white society to allow greater civil activity for African Americans, economic rights, legal rights, but particularly voting rights. One of the major proponents of voting rights in Florida, for instance, was Harry T. Moore and his wife, Harriet. The Moores were active in the civil rights movement. Both of them were educators, and they had registered many African Americans in Florida to be able to vote. On Christmas Day, 1951, a bomb exploded under their bedroom in their home in Broward County, Florida. Harry was killed outright. Harriet died a few days later. But they were only two of several martyrs to the civil rights movement before the Board v. Brown Board of Education case desegregating schools in 1954, and before the Montgomery boycott instigated by Rosa Parks. There's been a constant number of individuals who fighting for civil rights before that those particular events drew national attention, who were killed by the terrorists involved in trying to preserve white supremacy. Harry Moore kept his wallet, his pocket watch, and then his wife Harriet wore the small lady's wristwatch. The small locket which Harriet wore contains photographs of herself and her husband Harry. These are the personal elements that survived the bombing of their home in 1951. Another example of pre-civil rights era activism comes from the example of Esau and Jeannie Jenkins in Johns Island, South Carolina, just outside of Charleston. The Jenkins created a society, a group called the Progressive Society, which operated a cooperative store, a small motel, a gas station. They also bought a Volkswagen van in the late 1950s and began ferrying individuals from Johns Island into their jobs in Charleston. But it wasn't simply a transportation service. During the ride from the island into town and back at night, Janie would teach the individuals literacy skills, teach them how to read and write. And particularly, she would use the Constitution of the state of South Carolina to teach them about voting rights so that they would have the opportunity to take the test and apply for voter registration. So they combined a service along with an opportunity for African Americans to gain their rights. In the midst of a segregated society, transportation was one of the great challenges for both African Americans and whites. How to create separation for whites, but allow transportation for the black community. This railway car, built in 1923, was only in 1940 renovated to create separate sections. That is, the system became more restrictive as time went on and as more African Americans joined the traveling ranks. But long distance travel, this car was made for the Southern Railways and traveled between Washington, D.C. and New Orleans, had to accommodate the notion of increasingly segregated society. Let's go inside and take a look. As a white passenger, I'd look at this portion of the car and say, okay, these are nice large seats. I'm quite comfortable here. I've got lots of room. I can look out the windows. I can enjoy a smoke-free atmosphere, because when I get back here, I see I've got room to store my large luggage. I don't have to keep it right on my lap. And I've got a restroom with a lounge that allows for smoking out of the main car, and a fairly large restroom that is quite accommodating for passengers. But if I were an African American passenger, I would walk into this section and take a look and say, all right, these seats are fine, but there's no place to store my luggage other than a small overhead rack. So if I have a large bag, I've got to keep it with me on my lap or right at my feet. And I look around and I see, well, there's no other accommodations except a very small toilet area, restroom, with no lounge. In other words, it's a much different experience for long distance travel for African Americans, and it's clearly an inferior experience. When the Supreme Court of the United States announced that separate but equal was inherently unequal in American education in the Brown v. Board case, it opened the door for opportunity for other African Americans to argue about that same kind of inferiority in separate but equal situations. In 1955, Rosa Parks, with a long career in activism, decided that she couldn't take it anymore, that she really needed to find out what her rights as an African American were. And so she refused to give up her seat on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Parks, who worked as a seamstress, was actually sewing this dress at home during the period in which she refused to give up her seat. This was her project at home. Similarly, another woman early on in the civil rights movement was quite a different, not a 40-year-old married woman with a job, but a 14-year-old high school student by the name of Carlotta Walls in Little Rock, Arkansas, who simply wanted the best education she could get because she had an ambition of becoming a doctor. And so when the opportunity to attend the best high school in Little Rock, Central High School, Carlotta signed up and became one of what became later known as the Little Rock Nine, the first 9 African American students to integrate Little Rock Central High School in 1957. That's the dress that Carlotta wore the first day of school in 1957, when she was in fact denied access to the school. But it was a dress that exemplified her desire as a 14-year-old to get the best education and to put herself forward in a situation where she could be respected as a human being and achieve her ambitions. Again, a very typical American story. Quite a different story is Joan Trompauer, a 19-year-old white student at Duke University in 1960. Joan was a devout Christian and simply figured that the civil rights movement expressed Christian values, and therefore joined sit-ins in Durham, North Carolina, ultimately became a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and spent 4 years in the movement, was one of the Freedom Riders, arrested, served time in Parchman Prison in Mississippi, and carried with her the notion of an interracial, multiracial cooperation that would lead to civil rights for all Americans. This is Joan's vest, in which she collected all the buttons that she had that represented the various causes she believed in, and created her own monument and memorial and reminder of her activities in the movement in the early 1960s. Of course, Martin Luther King was the inspirational leader of the 1960s civil rights movement and has become the symbol of that movement for many Americans. Although, as we've seen, he was certainly not the only individual who was primary to that movement and those activities. In 2014, King posthumously and his widow, Coretta Scott King, were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award, civilian award for Americans. King, however, had evolved during the civil rights movement. He had moved from specifically interested in civil rights for African Americans, particularly voting rights and the end to segregation, to a broader critique of American society that included a critique of the Vietnam War and of American poverty that affected all races, and therefore began a larger approach to change in America. At this point, we're going to move on to the next exhibition, A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond. Having left the exhibition on the era of segregation, we're moving now to the new exhibition, the final exhibition in the three-part history galleries, A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond. And you can sense a difference in the tone and the tenor of the African-American liberation movement. The late 1960s was an era of black power. And it was also an era of the transition of the philosophies of Martin Luther King, particularly his development of the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial campaign for economic justice and the end to poverty that King had initiated just before his assassination in 1968. The mural behind me is one of the representations of that campaign, which was embodied in Resurrection City, a tent city here in Washington, D.C. in May and June of 1968. King's vision was for a multiracial campaign that would bring Americans, Native Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, poor white individuals, from all parts of the country to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress and the presidency for economic changes, not merely civil rights for one group, but for changes in the fundamental economic system that would alleviate poverty in America. This mural, which was painted, one of many painted on the plywood that was made up part of the tent city that housed 3,500 individuals on the mall in Washington, D.C., represents that kind of multiracial character of the campaign. It contains a number of representations from Chicanos. It was clearly made by individuals, both African American and Chicanos, interested in the movement, who brought their concerns and their culture to Washington, D.C. for this moment. We're assuming that it was produced in part by students from California, the University of the Pacific and the University of California at Los Angeles. But it's also evident that this could have been representing a number of individuals from various parts of the country, including the use of Amharic language, which expresses the hope that poverty can be ended in the United States. With King's death, his associate, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and his own widow, Coretta Scott King, continued the Poor People's Campaign. The tent city, Resurrection City, had permits from the federal government to set up on the National Mall. The weather was terrible, and for 6 weeks they tried in vain to lobby the federal government for fundamental change. At the end of those 6 weeks, the federal government bulldozed the city and evicted the residents, and then basically ended the campaign. Members of the People's Campaign who were Washington residents managed to find out where the bulldozed material had been taken to a local military base, and went by that base late at night and salvaged some of the material, including this plywood mural. Other materials, documents, and parts of the tents were also preserved by activists who literally kept them until they donated it to this museum. Many people think the Black Power campaign was a negation of the civil rights movement, that it was in opposition to civil rights. In fact, the nonviolent philosophy of Martin Luther King and the Black Power movement are not at odds, even though one of the symbols of the Black Power movement is this image of Huey Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California in 1966, holding a spear and a shotgun. Newton is the premier example of this sense of militant opposition to American society that the Panthers supposedly, allegedly represented. But in fact, much of their campaign was about self-defense for African Americans, the same kind of self-defense that had been seen earlier with the Deacons of Defense and earlier efforts in the military and other areas of African American life opposing violence against their society. Part of the Black Panther campaign, a major part, in fact, was social reform, educational reform, health care, housing, the freedom to get an education that was useful for them, and opposition to the legal system that was imprisoning thousands of African Americans with no good reason. So an element that we want to focus on and make known more widely to the American public is the whole notion of survival programs, that the party was developing a whole series of activities and pioneered the idea of legal aid, of health clinics, of educational programs, of free breakfast programs for school children. That the social reform that the Panthers advocated and symbolized was as important, probably more important, than the militaristic side and the militant activities that were highlighted in the press at the time. Another element of King's evolution was his development and opposition to the Vietnam War, an issue that rent American society in the 60s and early 70s. King in 1967 straight out said one of his greatest disappointments was America's failure to deal with the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. African American soldiers served in Vietnam, some willingly, some reluctantly, but they all took pride in their service, and they all did their utmost to serve their country, a tradition that had continued on from earlier wars in American history and since the Vietnam era. The Vietnam tour jacket was a common memento acquired by soldiers on R&R, often in Okinawa, the island off of Japan, where they would have them embroidered with symbols of their service. In this particular instance, an African American soldier not only had a tour jacket made to commemorate his service in Vietnam, but he had it adorned with symbols of Black Power, representing his dual commitment both to the Black Power movement and to his own service in the Vietnam War. Also in this area of a Changing America exhibition on the Black Power era is elements of the broad concerns, basically a renovation of the New Negro movement or the Harlem Renaissance of the early 20th century, a concern with literature, with culture, with representation. And so particularly the development of black women writers, black feminist critique of American society, the development and growth of Shirley Chisholm as the first black woman to run for major party nomination for the presidency, a political force on all of those levels through culture, politics, popular culture representation in mass media. The Black Power movement renovated and created yet another new African American way of expressing themselves and of taking power, of being represented and being in control of their own circumstances. And that created opportunities for subsequent generations. Black power in the civil rights movement opened up opportunities for African Americans in all realms of American life: politics, popular culture, literature, economic entrepreneurialism. Oprah Winfrey has become one of the great icons of late 20th century. Starting her talk show in 1986, she developed an empire that went beyond the business and talked about individual self-empowerment, creative opportunities, educational opportunities, and used her wealth and her influence to promote the kinds of ideas that the civil rights movement leaders and the Black Power leaders had advocated. Her career exemplifies that kind of opportunity and making the most of it, both individually and collectively. Miss Winfrey was kind enough to be a supporter of this museum and donated these artifacts from the last show aired in 2011 of her daytime talk show. In 2008, Barack Obama created a multiracial coalition that brought him to the presidency, a coalition that mirrored the type of multiracial coalition that Martin Luther King envisioned in 1968 for the Poor People's Campaign. Barack Obama's presidency did not represent a post-racial society as we have come to understand. Still, it represented a marked departure from previous American political life and created a new image of the black man and the black family in the lives of many African Americans and Americans. For whatever his legacy in terms of policies and the administration, his personal legacy and his impact on American political life will be seen as a very positive element in the future as historians consider and reconsider the impact of his presidency. We're lucky enough to have a president in Barack Obama who understood the impact of history and the importance of understanding history. So the artifacts that we have received from the White House include the dress that Michelle Obama, the First Lady, wore at the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington, and the comments signed by the president that he made on that occasion, acknowledging the history and the importance of the 1963 March on Washington, in which he makes clear that every generation has a responsibility to increase the rights and opportunities that all Americans enjoy. And it's that kind of opportunity and those challenges that is represented not only by his administration and by his understanding of history, but by the Black Lives Matter movement and others who seek ways of creating a more equal and just American society. The goal, the American experiment that we continue to have. I think the history galleries really demonstrate the power of social change through activism, that nothing happens by chance. I think they also demonstrate how the values represented in these exhibitions are quintessentially American values. They are about opportunity. They are optimistic. They are resilient. They are about enlarging the experience of all Americans, African Americans and others. They are a very optimistic American expression of overcoming the odds and of succeeding. And we think that's a very positive sign, and we hope that's the message, that positive change comes about and is absolutely possible as long as one is involved in the values and the processes of American democracy.